Thank you for joining us from across Tennessee today. Our entire team is deeply moved and overwhelmed by the response and interest that we've received from our students and our educators throughout Tennessee for this event. And our gratitude, if you can, while we're sort of letting everyone else come in, I would like to teachers, if you don't mind, to just drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. And if you don't mind sharing kind of your audience, if you're social studies, ELA, what grade you teach, something of that nature, whatever you're comfortable for, just so that Agnes can see where everybody's logged in from across the state. And before I introduce our featured speaker for this morning, I want to extend the Tennessee Holocaust Commission's sincerest gratitude and appreciation for our cherished friends at the Florence and Lawrence Spungen Family Foundation. Their generous partnership and work have really helped make this opportunity possible for us. So we thank you for that. And so today is my privilege and pleasure to welcome our featured speaker, Holocaust survivor Miss Agnes Schwartz, who is coming to us today through Zoom from Skokie, Illinois. Agnes was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1933. Before the war, she lived with her parents in a Jewish household, although attended a Catholic school. And her life changed in 1944 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Hungary. Her father and mother were separately taken away by the Nazis. Shortly thereafter, the family's non-Jewish maid Julia came to rescue Agnes. It is because of her heroism that Agnes is with us here today and here to share her story. So again, it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Miss Agnes Schwartz. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I did not only survive the Holocaust, but I also survived a stroke just about a year ago. So forgive me if I stumble on my words once in a while. As your teacher said, I was born in 1933 in Budapest. My parents and I lived in a lovely apartment. My parents owned a store whereby they sold yard goods to tailors to make custom-made suits and all the accessories. And since my mom also worked in their store, we had a living housekeeper. Her name was Julia. And if wasn't for Julia, I would not be here to tell my story. As your teacher introduced, I was sent to a Catholic school, although I had quite religious Jewish grandparents. And I've often asked myself why, and I can come up with two reasons. One is the safest place to send a young little girl to school, and the other is probably it was the best education in the area. My mother had three sisters, two in Hungary and two in America. One of my mom's sisters was a physician, so was her husband. And I know that my mother very much wanted me to walk in her footsteps. That, well, that didn't happen. Yeah. My parents tried to immigrate probably since 1942. And well, our first try, we had all our papers. And in the last minute, the Germans wouldn't give us the visa. our belongings were already enlistment, and they sent it back to us, and my life would have gone very, very differently had we been able to immigrate at that time. By the time, well, the school system in Hungary is such that you go to school for 4 years and then you graduate. And I talk about Catholic school. There were about 10 Jewish little girls in that school with me. And it's very interesting. I found no anti-Semitism in school at all. However, the Catholic kids played with the Catholic kids, and the Jewish kids played with the Jewish kids. But we did not intermingle. So by the time I graduated, Hungary was being bombed. And it was usually in the dark of the night that the bombs came. I lived on the third floor of a 3-story building. We all grabbed something warm and had it for the basement. And when the all clear signal came up, we went back upstairs and went back to sleep. And this became such a routine that in the morning I got up and went to school, and my parents got up and went to work. And somehow it just became a way of life. I had a set of grandparents, my mother's parents, in a small town called Rakosliga. And it was about an hour train ride from Budapest. And I spent a lot of especially my summer vacations with Grandma and Grandpa. I remember the birds singing and the rooster crowing to wake me up in the morning. My life couldn't have been better until the Nazis came marching in. My dad had a well-going business. We were able to do, take summer vacations. It's been beautiful. Lake Palestine, and in the winter time, we went to the Cakish Mountains. And life was very good in general. I adored my parents. I wasn't an only child, which was not unusual for that time. I think people were afraid to have children. And after I graduated the Catholic school, I went on to the Jewish gymnasium. That was a college preparatory school that you were able to go to after you graduated from the fourth grade. It depended on your grades, whether they accepted you there or not. Your teacher told you a little bit about my mother and father being taken away. We were, well, after the Nazis came in, that's when my life changed for the worse. Uh, we had to wear the yellow star, regardless of your age. And Jewish people became totally unaccepted in civilization. Julia took me home with her when things got dicey. And my mom and dad were both gone, but I still had grandma with us. So, and one day she knocked on the door and we couldn't imagine who it was. And then there was Julia. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Um, yeah. Oh, we took off my yellow star and we got on the streetcar to go to Julia's house. And on that trip, she asked me questions about the Catholic religion. So in case somebody asked me, I would be able to answer. For a while, our life was relatively normal at Julia's because she had beans and potatoes and smoked meats in her pantry. And I remember her even baking bread at the beginning. You can't imagine how difficult it is for a 10, 11-year-old child not to cry out and say, I want to go home to my mommy and dad. And I knew I couldn't do that. Julie had a neighbor who was very much a Nazi sympathizer. And I knew my life depended on it. We told the story that my parents lived in the eastern part of Hungary and the Russians were already occupying that territory. And so my parents sent me to my aunt to get me away from the Russian occupation. And then one day, all of a sudden, it started to rain bombs from the air. And it was nonstop, night and day. And now this was a 5-story building, and we all headed for the basement. This basement was not designed to for living conditions for anybody. I remember taking blankets and pillows and piling them up on chopped wood that was properly stacked for stoking a furnace. And Julia would run up between bombings and grab some food. We lived by candlelight and not by electricity. And the worst part of the basement was that there were a lot of people there and there were no toilet facilities. A bucket was passed around and the waste was thrown out of the basement in the dark of night. We lived like that for a couple of months. Julia took me home in November, and in January, um, word started to pass from apartment buildings to apartment buildings that the Russians were freeing us, therefore the Jews were free. And well, finally, we had enough nerve to walk out of the basement. I could not see anything because of the darkness to the light, and but I could smell, and I could smell the odor of death. There were dead horses all over the street, and there were dead people all over the street, and people were running out with a carving knife to carve up the horses for a meal. But we were, at last, we were free. And then we went up to Julia's apartment, and we didn't have telephones like we have today. All we could do was wait for the family, whoever survived, to contact us. I was playing out in front of Julia's door when I looked up one day, and there was my daddy walking up the stairs. My father by nature was a very handsome man, and now he was all yellow, and obviously he was not well. He came in to Julia's, and we all hugged, and he finally sat down and told us how he survived. He survived in a Swedish protected home. A Swedish diplomat was charged with buying up all the apartment buildings in Budapest, and of course, for a fee, he allowed Jews to hide in there. And that's the way my father really survived. In the meantime, they had taken my mother away, and I was 11 years old, and some of the last words were, I'll see you soon, except I never got to see her again. She died at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. So the war was over and life began to take some normalcy. And my father got his business back, and I went back to school. And it was like a deep, dark secret among all of us, because none of us asked each other how we survived, whether our parents were still alive or not. I think we were all so traumatized and that we simply couldn't ask. Even the teachers did not talk about it that at that time. I went back to school and I thought it would be very normal for a bunch of teenagers to ask how we weathered the war. And there was no question about it. Now, one day my dad came home in tears from the store and he told me that the Budapest ghetto was formed shortly after I went home with Julia. And they herded the remaining Jews into the ghetto, and that included my grandma and my mother's sister and her husband, who were still in Budapest. The Nazis, the Hungarian Nazi Party, the Arrow Cross, was even worse than the Nazis. And they knew the war was over and their days were numbered. And so they took a bunch of people in the dark of night, woke them up to the shores of the Danube, and tied them together with a wire. And that way, with one gunshot, they all sank to the bottom of the icy river. And that was the fate of my darling grandmother. And yeah. And then somebody, a different day, my dad came home from the business and he was crying. And he told me that my mother, somebody came into the store who was with my mother and Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And my mother supposedly died of natural causes because there was typhus and a lack of food. So now we knew there was nobody to wait for to come back. And in January 1945, no, January 1947, my father and I were one of the first ones leaving Hungary and heading for the United States. We took a train from Budapest to Berlin. We spent a night in a bombed-out hotel. The next day we got on the plane and it was a propeller plane headed for New York. We were ushered into a beautiful white tablecloth dining room. And can you imagine, for the first time in my life, I saw ice cubes in a glass. In Budapest, you never saw an ice cube in a glass. The iceman brought the ice and put it in the ice box. So to pass the time of day, my daddy told me stories about this wonderful land we're going to. And among many other things, he said everybody is rich in America and nobody washes clothes. And you just throw it out and buy new. And above all, I would be the princess because my three cousins are all boys. And that really didn't work out that way. Because I was a girl, I was asked to wash the dishes every night. And, you know, I never dared complain, but I would mutter to myself under my breath, princesses, no, don't wash dishes. I was enrolled in grammar school because of my English problems. And there I was promoted little by little from the third grade to the eighth grade by the end of the semester. My physician uncle and aunt came to see us, and they heard my father coughing, and right away they arranged for a chest x-ray, and he had tuberculosis. And off to Winfield Sanitarium they shipped him. And there I was left with an American family. And I had to learn about new ways and new language. And it was very, very difficult. It came the following January. I had learned enough English to graduate and go on to high school. And it was just about the same time my daddy was pronounced negative, and he was coming home to me. And I was so happy that he was coming home to me. And I thought, now he'll make a home for me. And that wasn't the way it worked out either, because he wanted to go back to Hungary. I cried many tears. I did not want him to leave me. And I was 14 when he went back to Hungary, and that's the last time I ever saw him. He eventually remarried, married our lady with 2 kids, and well,
That's, we've got about 5 more minutes to talk. and We're
okay.
gonna open it up for questions. The students
Okay.
they're ready for, they're
Thank you.
excited to ask you questions. About 5 more minutes
Okay.
to talk.
I got heavy because there was a hole in my heart from all the people I lost. These people, they were my mother's sister, and they told me they loved me, but that's not the way I felt. I wanted my family that I really knew I grew up with. Anyhow, when I was a senior in high school, a friend of mine asked if I wanted to go on a blind date, and I said, sure. And that's when I met Danny Kissay. And by golly, there was a boy who liked me. And he called more and more often, and he came around more and more often. And before my 18th birthday, he asked me to marry him. Marry him? He was 4 years older than I am. Anyhow, for my 18th birthday, I got a little engagement ring, and the following October, Jenny and I got married. I was happy for the first time in the United States. We had 3 children, and then I was really happy after that because I had my little chickens to take care of. I had a loving husband. Unfortunately, my husband got sick. Oh, we had about 13 happy years. And okay, I think I have to finish up so you can ask some questions. But my husband was a paranoid schizophrenic, and it was very frightening to live with him. And I sought advice from the Jewish Federation. And I said, well, I never actually made a living. And now they offer to send me to college. I said to myself, you offering to send me to college? I don't have 4 years. I have to feed my kids. And so I went to business college for a year, and that enabled me to make a living. And Danny and I got divorced since I knew that I couldn't help him. And well, my three kids grew up and they also got married, and I had four grandchildren and eventually seven great grandchildren. And I wish I had more time. I could tell you more, but I know I want to leave you time to ask me some questions.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for sharing your family story with us and your story of survival. And I know from reading your testimony as well as hearing you present before as well, that one of the most important aspects of this story is the heroism of your non-Jewish maid, Julia, who risked her life to save yours. We have a question from a teacher who is asking, what would you have done without her?
I must have been probably just deported and killed. The Nazis had no use for Jewish children.
And do you want to explain what happened to Julia?
No. Well, after my father and I left, I corresponded with Julia. And my father wrote me that she died. And Israel had just become a state just about that time. And there's this very famous museum, Yad Vashem, in Israel. And I started to correspond with them. And they kept wanting proof. I couldn't send them any proof. And they had to take my word for it. Anyhow, eventually they did accept her into the avenue of the righteous Christians.
And I think that's a key part that she's been acknowledged as righteous among the nations for the
Yes,
heroism she gave.
yeah, yes. And I was in Israel a few years ago. I was at Yad Vashem, and I cried my eyes out there because I was now old enough to really realize the sacrifice she made to save my life.
We have a few of the teachers who are asking similar questions that say, what advice would you give young people today for how they should think about the Holocaust and what you want them to learn and know about the Holocaust?
Well, it was a terrible, terrible time in history. Innocent people were killed for nothing. Please don't let anybody deny there was a Holocaust, because while you only met me on the television, and there are still quite a few of us, and there was a Holocaust with gas chambers and all kinds of horrors. And don't ever forget that that's what happened, and don't ever let it happen again. If
Another,
you go ahead.
one teacher has asked you to share what was the worst part about living in the basement.
No toilet facilities. The place got very smelly very quickly. And boy, we just throw the waste out at night. you either live with the stink or you went out and got bombed, and that wasn't much of a choice.
And there's other questions still coming in as well. Agnes, could you tell us a little bit more about Raoul Wallenberg's connection to your father? Do you know if he helped your father?
Well, yeah, my father to live in his Swedish protected homes. So, um,
So yes, Raoul Wallenberg saved
my
Agnes's father.
father, yeah.
And I have a group of students from Nashville who are curious about what the ghetto conditions were like. What was the ghetto and what was life like inside the ghetto?
Well, first we had the Jewish designated homes, and then they pushed people into the ghetto. And the ghetto was fenced in. Nobody was allowed to go in or out. There was horrible sanitation concerns, and people were dying left and right from the lack of sanitation and the lack of food. Food was extremely scarce. And I can't tell you any details about the ghetto because I never lived there, but I can only tell you what I heard.
One person has asked us what gives you hope, both then and when you were living through the war, what gave you hope and what now?
Oh God, I hope that my children and grandchildren will have a better world than I grew up in. I've had so many heartaches that I can't begin to tell you. I want kids to know that they have to have a profession or a trade or something they can do before they go out in the world, because you never know when your family will have to rely on you to make a living. That's very important.
And was there, the second part of that, was there something during the war years that gave you hope while the war was still going on?
Well, the worst, I had hope that my mother would come back. Very much, yeah. I I am now 92 years old, and I still think about my mother a great deal. I'll tell you an example. I was working in an office, and I was going downtown on the CTA, and suddenly I was having some pains in my left arm. And I had to decide whether I'm going to work or go to a hospital. And I got off the train and I spotted a taxi. And to this day, I think my mother sent a taxi to me so I should go to the hospital, because I averted a serious heart attack by going at that time.
Agnes, are there any books that you recommend for teachers or for students to study the Holocaust? Any that you think are particularly good?
Well, I wrote the book. Can I hold mine up?
I've got it. It looks like
Oh,
well,
there we
that's the
go.
back of it. It's this one. It's a roll of the dice. So
Yeah,
That is a good one.
yeah. And many other, you know, I became very involved with the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and several of the survivors wrote books. Uh, I can tell you especially about Sam Harris. He wrote a couple of books. And anytime you go into a bookshop or in a museum, you can find books on the Holocaust.
there's an interesting question in the chat that asks, did when the war was ending, did you know who was fighting? Did you know if the liberating soldiers were Russian or American?
Yes, yes, we knew that the liberating soldiers were Russian. Uh, and I'm trying to think how we know. All I can tell you is that word was going around from building to building that the Russians were liberating us, and that's the way I know.
I'm going to
Uh,
ask a follow-up very quickly, Agnes, to that because you talk about this in your book. What were
yeah,
your thoughts about the Russians when you saw them?
I was free again. They were God to me, you know. They came to save us. Yeah, I was not afraid of them. I was too young to realize that they were raping women and even little girls. And for a while, Hungary became communist territory. But most of it happened after my father and I had left Hungary.
One of the teachers asked, "Have you been back to Hungary?"
No,
And
no,
a follow-up, what made your father decide he wanted to go back to Hungary? Could you connect a little more with that?
yeah. Uh, he had trouble learning the language. You know, I'm very conflicted even to this day about him leaving me. I have times when I'm very bitter about him deserting his little girl, and there are times when I think more like a grown up and instead of a teenager. And then I can forgive him or leave. He needed to make himself alive too.
And in case you missed it before, Agnes said no, she has not been back
No,
to Hungary.
never. No.
I like this question. What was food like for you during the war years? What kinds of things were you eating?
Good question. Beans, potatoes, uh, smoked meats. You know, I had to skip a part of my story because it wouldn't be too long. My father and I got on a freight train and got off in a small town or village. And that's, I knocked on a farmer's store and they um, made arrangements. I mean, he needed good food and rest. And that lady made the most delicious bowl of scrambled eggs I have ever eaten because I haven't as much as seen a fresh egg for years by that time.
And I know that we're sort of getting to the end of our hour block, but I did want to ask you this question that's in the chat. Do you have any family traditions or customs that you can remember from your childhood that you continue to carry on, to share with your family?
Yes, I do. Uh, I remember going to temple with my parents on the high holidays. And, unfortunately, after my kids grew up and they moved all over the Sun Belt, they all hated the Chicago winters. And so we are no longer together on the high holidays. That's what I was trying to say. Hmm.
And Agnes, there's an interesting comment here coming in as well from Danny Spungen, who I know you know. Can Michaela, he's asking if we can have see the tiny glass deer in the cabinet in this situation, if we can maneuver that. That after the war, by luck, Agnes was able to get their apartment back. People were nice and did not fight to kick them out. And that the glass deer that Agnes brought was from her mother.
Organica,
So yeah, do you want to,
Caroline went together.
yep, do you want to explain about the apartment while she's grabbing the beer?
Uh, well, after we went to the small village and we came back to our original apartment and we found a family living there. And, there were decent people and people who were horrible. And this family was a decent family because they kept all our belongings that we left behind inside. Okay, Michaela, I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, it's in the camera. So there's one. It's very delicate.
Can
And
you see?
there's a little tiny one.
So these are two little deer, and that I don't know how they survived the war, but they did, and they came with me to America. Yeah,
it's very special.
very special. And I also got a little ring from Julia. One. And she came to the railroad station to see us off. She knows she never seen me again.
I know that we've reached sort of the last minutes of it, but Agnes, I have one sort of question that I would like to ask on behalf of the students and teachers in Tennessee that comes up often when we speak with audiences. One of the things that you talk a lot about is that there are good people and there were really people who were not good on both
Yes.
sides of this. And that the choice to act correctly rests with the individual. How can our students and our teachers help our students learn to make that choice of choosing to act correctly when the moment really matters?
You know, That really has to be taught in the home. And teachers can certainly reinforce it. But there are people who hold up banks, and other people donate to children's hospitals. Good and the bad, and we always have that in our civilization. I do want to tell your students to please hold up democracy as much as you can, because that's one of the dearest things you have in your life. Next to food and water, if you don't have democracy, you don't have a decent life.
Well, I want to thank everybody who has joined us from across Tennessee to hear Agnes share her story and to bear witness to this opportunity of hearing firsthand testimony of the Holocaust. Thank you very much on behalf of the Tennessee Holocaust Commission and the Spungen Family Foundation. And thank you so much to Miss Agnes Schwartz for taking an hour out of your day to speak and share testimony with students across the state.
It has been my pleasure to do that.